video tutorial, I'll show you how to summarize and visualize data using Excel. Here I have a hypothetical data set with groups A, B, and C, and their numeric responses. And I want to summarize the mean, or the average, the standard deviation, which is an estimate of the variation around the mean, or the spread of the data, N, my sample size, and then SE for standard error, sometimes abbreviated SEM for standard error of the mean. Standard error is an estimate of how precise my estimate of the mean is. It's calculated as the standard deviation over the square root of the sample size. So the larger the sample size, the smaller my standard error, because the more precise my estimate of the mean is. All right, so let's start with the mean. To do that, I'm going to hit equals to do a calculation in Excel and type in average, the function to do this. And I could either manually type in the numbers, or I can just drag and drop my selection to highlight the cells that I want to summarize. Type that in, and there I have the average. For the standard deviation, I'm going to hit equals, and the function is STDEV. So I start typing that in, and it'll auto-populate. Notice that there's a couple other versions of the standard deviation. We want to use just the straight STDEV, not the ones with .ps, etc. And again, I'm going to highlight group A, hit enter. For N, the function I'll use is called count. So again, I hit equals and count, click, drag and drop. Now for standard error, there's no built-in function in Excel to calculate this. Instead, I can type in the equation that I need to do it. So I'm going to do equals, because this is the standard deviation over the square root of the sample size, I'm going to select the standard deviation, use backdash for divide, and then there is a function for calculating the square root. It's SQRT. So I'll type that in and select my sample size. And there I have my standard error calculation. Now to do those summaries for B and C, I could either manually do those same steps over again, or because I have set up these columns in my summary table in the same order as the columns in my raw data table, the other thing I can do is just highlight these and drag these functions across to populate these cells. So for group A, it highlighted that first row. Now because first column, now because I dragged the column 1 to the right, it's highlighting the raw data 1 to the right. If I then took my let's take a step back. So here, if I didn't want it to select the column 1 to the right when I dragged it over, I could put a $sign in front of my columns. If I didn't want it to change what rows it referenced, if I dragged this up and down, I can put a $sign in front of the numbers for the rows. That creates what's called an absolute reference versus a relative reference. So let's just test that out and make sure that worked. Here, when I drag this down, I still have the same value. So I can still see it selecting the same rows, even though I dragged it down a row. When I drag it over to the right one column, it's still selecting column B. In this case, I want to have that relative reference, so I'm going to undo that, but you can use that trick in the future. All right, so now I have a nice summary table of my data with the mean, standard deviation, sample size, and the standard error. Now I want to create a graph showing this data. So I'm going to select the means and the different treatment groups and go to Insert. Here in the middle of this upper bar, I'm going to go to Recommended Charts. I could also select charts from over here. So in this case, because I have a categorical explanatory variable and a numeric response variable, typical charts would include something like a bar chart or a box plot. I'm going to do a bar chart. So Excel has a standard format that it has for its charts. For fields like if you're creating a graph for a news report, it'd be really appropriate to have a chart title because that's more common in popular media. For fields like scientific fields, it's considered best practice to have a figure caption instead of a chart title because it provides a little bit more detailed information. So to get rid of this chart title, I'm just going to select it, delete that, And this is a personal preference, but I don't like these grid lines. I find them distracting, so I'm going to select that and delete that. I want to add in a vertical y-axis line. To do that, I'm going to select this, go into Format Axis, and here there's Fill and Line. I'm going to Line, Solid Line, and I can select what color I want. I'm going to do a light gray to match the line on the x-axis. All right, now I might want to add in labels to my x and y axis. To do that, I'm going to select the chart and go up here to Add Chart Element, Axis Titles, and I can add in an x-axis title. Let's call this Group. Oops. Let's make that not in capitals. And then I'm going to do that again for the y-axis. This is some sort of response variable. Here I haven't specified the units, but you'd want to write whatever the units are. Great. So now I have a nicely formatted graph. The last thing that I want to add is right here I'm showing the mean of each of these groups here, but I don't show anything about the spread of the data. So to do that, I'm going to want to add in some error bars. In this case, I'm going to use the standard error, which is an estimate of how precise our means are, versus the standard deviation would be an estimate of what's the typical variation around a mean. Standard error is better for when you're doing statistical comparisons of groups, and standard deviation is better for when you just want to describe ranges of data. So to do that, I'm going to click the chart, go here to Add Chart Element, and if I go here to error bars, you'll notice that it has these automatic ones that it can add. So let's click standard error and see. So notice that the standard error is the same for all of these bars, even though when I calculated the standard error, it wasn't the same. So when Excel calculates the standard error, it's going to take the means for A, B, and C and calculate the standard error from those means. I don't want that because I know that's not correct, so I'm going to overwrite it by clicking on this, go to Add Chart Element, Error Bars, and instead I'm going to go to More Error Bar Options. Over here in Format Error Bars, I'm going to go to Standard Error Custom and specify the value. And I'm going to select the standard errors that I calculated for standard errors above and below the mean and hit OK. Now we can see that the error bars to this middle group, which had a much larger standard error, are in fact larger. I really like standard error because it provides a visual display of how closely the groups might be related. So here for group A and B, the mean of group B is a little bit lower than group A, but the error bars overlap. Just by visually looking at the data and seeing that the error bars overlap, I can get a good idea that if I ran a statistical test comparing groups A and B, I wouldn't find a statistical difference between them. That's not always true, but for the most part, if error bars overlap, there probably isn't a statistically significant difference if those error bars are showing standard error of the mean. Here for group C, this group's error bars don't overlap with that and has a really different mean. So if we ran a test between these groups, my guess is that C would be significantly different. All right, so now we have this chart and we have this table, and I could take this chart and table, put them into a Word document, create some nice report, and the last touches that I want to add, we're doing things like adding in this figure caption here. So differences in whatever response we measured across treatment groups A, B, and C. I'm going to specify our sample size, and then I'm going to tell the reader what the error bars show, because people might put error bars that show standard deviation, the 95% confidence interval, standard error, etc. We have to tell our reader what they're looking at. For my table, I'm going to also add in a caption. Notice that for figures, the figure caption goes below. For tables, the caption goes above the table. Don't ask me why, that's just the format in biology. So I add in a description saying this is the mean, standard deviation, sample size, and standard error of the mean for groups A, B, and C. All right, thank you for joining this tutorial. I hope that helps you summarize and visualize data using Excel.